Hello everyone and welcome to Sit Shadow Work. So what exactly is Sit Shadow Work? Sit Shadow Work is very different from regular shadow work. So regular shadow work is looking at your unconscious thoughts, feelings, memories, behaviours, using something like a journal, for example, where people will just fill out the blanks and see if they can tap into their unconscious. For me, that's not deep enough, and it's not necessarily what Jung would have suggested, although he did recommend journaling, but he was very much a believer of looking at ourselves in a much deeper level, using unconscious images, using symbolic images. That is the language of the unconscious. So we use the language of the unconscious to go deeper into our own unconscious. So that's why I will use, let's say, the archetypal images of the scorpion and the frog. Those images have stood the test of time. Using talking animal stories is part of fables, the fable tradition, which has been used for thousands of years to deliver a moral or a message to people. So for example, Aesop's fables, which is where the scorpion and the frog fable potentially originated from. So I use the scorpion and the frog story to help people to understand more about their own unconscious, using the symbolism and the imagery, the archetypal imagery of the scorpion and the frog. And so it goes not just to your conscious understanding, not even just to your personal unconscious, which is what you consciously are aware of, but then it also goes to the third layer of consciousness, which is the collective unconscious. And it's the collective unconscious where we have the deepest, most ingrained behaviors, let's say. This is what we inherit from our ancestors. This is things like ancestral memories, memories that are stored in the brainstem. We have things like epigenetics, which is talking about inherited cultural grief and things like that. So those sorts of things are very deep-seated in our collective unconscious that we inherit from other people or the world around us. And so the personal unconscious, the collective unconscious, and becoming conscious of what's in the unconscious, that's the purpose of going and using the symbolic stories and images in Sit Shadow Work. So it's grounded in research. It's been used now for many years with literally thousands of people, and the research has been refined. The SIT tools are now evidence-based. So the difference between, let's say, regular shadow work and story image therapy shadow work is that the story image therapy symbolism of the stories and the images, the SIT tools, are actually grounded in research. And not only that, but I've actually used those SIT tools on myself as the originator of the therapy, and also the originator of Sit Shadow Work, which is story image therapy shadow work. I've actually used those tools on myself to help heal my own wounds, which is very important, I think, because if you're going to be using a method, any method, yes, you can spend a lot of money and it may or it may not be effective. The person may or may not have actually used the research, used the therapy on themselves. You don't know really what you're going to get. So you're potentially throwing money away, and sometimes very expensive too to do shadow work can be. If you are also working with someone who, let's say, is not trained in mental health, because the potential is there to spark a mental health issue. And so it's sort of leaving the person open to litigation. It's also leaving the client in a vulnerable position where you don't know whether the tools that are being used on you are in fact evidence-based, grounded in research, the person's trained or not trained in doing shadow work using evidence-based tools. So it's sort of like a potluck thing, where you may or may not be finding it effective, which is why a lot of people decide to just do their own shadow work. And the problem with that is they can actually potentially open a can of worms and may not be able to put the lid back on the can. So I say to people, it is really important that you have a trained shadow work practitioner beside you, somebody who does understand mental health, who can know whether to refer you to the appropriate service. If you are in fact demonstrating mental health symptoms, that person needs to be trained to recognize those warning signs and those triggers, because if they're not, and they're just doing, I don't know, some TikTok video or getting some journal or resource off the internet, yeah, you just don't know what you're going to get, and you don't know what the results are likely to be. So I would say, if you're going to do shadow work, which is extremely important for all of us actually, to do our own shadow work and work on our own unconscious issues, but if you are going to do it, then it needs to be done properly, and it needs to be done with the best of intentions. Do no harm is my motto, and I think that's extremely important when it comes especially to digging around in someone's unconscious. Is sort of, you know, it's a privilege, and it's not something to be taken lightly. And allowing somebody else to dig around into your unconscious as well, I would say, don't just let anybody do that. You need to really trust the person, know that they know what they're talking about, know that they are in fact people who've been through it. It's extremely important, you know, like Jung said, only the wounded healer can truly heal, and I do believe that. Having been through there myself in that situation where I had to heal myself, and using my own therapy, I actually then really understood the value of what I had created. But up until then, I'd been using it for like 10 years with people, and never actually thought of using sit shadow work on myself, which is a really interesting thing, but it's a fact. I'd been doing it for a long time. I got great results, great feedback, but it wasn't until only a few years ago that I actually decided I needed something deeper than just regular cognitive conscious methods. And that's when I decided to use this therapy, which I realized later was me doing my own shadow work all the way along, creating these resources, what I thought were resources for other people, but actually found that they were resources for myself. Didn't know it at the time, of course. I just soldiered on and thought, okay, I'm doing this to help other young people, or, you know, other people in general. And it was actually trying to heal complexes in my own shadow that I was working on. So yeah, shadow work is extremely important. And why do we have to do it? Is because we will have these unconscious thoughts, feelings, memories, behaviors that are popping up, sometimes in the most unpleasant ways, sometimes in ways that we would much rather that they didn't. And so they will, let's say, potentially sabotage our own personal relationships. They will make us feel inadequate, or they'll make us feel like we're not good enough. How do we overcome those things? First step is we have to become conscious of what's in our unconscious, because we can't change what we don't recognize. So once we recognize the complexes that are in our shadow, we are then in a position to be able to work on the shadow, that shadow self. But we can't do it until we are in fact ready. And that's why I say to people, it's a process. It's not something that's easy. It's not something that's necessarily fun. But it is something that is needed if we want to develop personally and professionally. We have to start to recognize not just the things that we like and admire about ourselves, but actually the things that we dislike and we tend to squash down or suppress, or don't want to acknowledge the inadequacies, let's say, or the insecurities that we might have. And yet we've all got them. We've all got things, issues in our unconscious, unresolved complexes that we have to work on. And so it's not an easy thing to actually admit that we've got these issues, and that we do need to go deeper, and we do need to work on these areas in a much deeper way. It's not something that's an easy thing to admit, but if we don't, then it'll just stay there. In fact, it won't just stay there, it'll manifest and it'll get bigger, and then we're in trouble. So yes, okay, got to work on it, simple as that. Okay, and we do it through sit shadow work. Thank you.